A secret file, a vanished name, and a young woman the Gestapo called highly dangerous. She carried no weapon, only a radio and a courage they could not break. Who was the gentle girl behind the codename Madeleine? And how did her silence become deadlier than any bullet? Stay, this is the spy story they tried to erase. They found her name in a file that wasn't supposed to exist. Not in a history book, not in a medal ceremony. In a faded Gestapo dossier, buried in an archive, half-eaten by time, a single line jumped out, written in tight German script. Codename, Madeleine, highly dangerous, must be broken. Who was she? Not a general, not a famous politician, not a decorated war hero. She was a young woman with a soft voice, a foreign accent, and a radio set on her back that weighed more than her fear. Her real name was Noor Inayat Khan. You don't usually start a war story with someone like her. She didn't shout orders. She didn't carry a rifle. She wasn't trained to kill. She was trained to disappear. The first time London heard about her, she wasn't sitting in a briefing room or marching in uniform. She was turning pages of a storybook. Before the war, Noor wrote children's tales and played music on the harp. Her world was made of words and melodies, not maps and targets. Her father was a spiritual teacher, a Sufi musician from India. Her mother, a quiet American woman who loved poetry. Noor grew up between worlds, Parisian streets outside, Eastern philosophy inside. The neighbors knew her as a gentle girl who avoided arguments, who hated violence, who sometimes cried over sad endings in books. So how does a woman like that end up on a secret list of most dangerous agents in Nazi-occupied France? That's the part the file didn't explain. What the file did say was this. In the summer of 1943, a woman dropped into the darkness over France from the belly of a British aircraft. She was small, nervous, but steady. Her codename was Madeleine. Her radio set, packed into a heavy suitcase, was her lifeline and her death sentence. But long before that jump, before the codename, before the suitcase full of wires and risk, there was a decision. London was changing. The city hummed with sirens and rumors. The air smelled of smoke and urgency. Posters shouted from the walls, "Careless talk costs lives." Men vanished into units with names nobody repeated out loud. Among them, the Special Operations Executive, SOE. Churchill had given them a simple job description. Set Europe ablaze. They were recruiting people who could slip into enemy territory and become ghosts. People who looked ordinary, sounded believable, and could do something most soldiers couldn't. Blend in, listen, send information back, and, if necessary, die without leaving a trace. Noor volunteered. It didn't make sense to the instructors at first. She was quiet. She was physically slight. She disliked weapons. In training, she was uncomfortable with pistols and refused to celebrate when she hit a target. But when they sat her in front of a radio transmitter and told her, "Imagine this is the only voice your friends have in a city full of enemies," something changed. Her fingers stopped shaking. Her back straightened. She listened, really listened, to the rhythm of the signals. Did-da, da-dit. Codes and numbers flew from London to the continent and back again. Her instructors made notes in the margins of her file. Not suitable as field leader. Too sensitive, but exceptional as a wireless operator. Calm under pressure, excellent discipline. Wireless operators in occupied France had the shortest life expectancy of any agents. The Germans could triangulate a signal in under 30 minutes. Every minute on air was a countdown toward arrest, torture, and a bullet in the back of the neck. SOE needed volunteers anyway. They needed someone for Paris. Someone who spoke perfect French, who knew the streets, who could send messages and vanish into the crowd. Noor's name moved from the training file to the deployment list. The night before she left, she walked alone along the airfield, the grass dark and damp under her boots. The Lysander aircraft waited like a crouched animal. Short wings, powerful engine, designed to slip in and out of enemy territory like a whispered secret. A British officer approached her. "You know the risks," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she replied. "You can still refuse." She looked at the plane. then up at the stars. My family left Paris when the Germans came. She said quietly, I did nothing then. I will not do nothing now. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't anger. It sounded almost like an apology to herself. He handed her a small cyanide pill in a metal container. If they catch you, he said, this is quicker. She held it in her palm for a long moment, then slipped it into her pocket. When the plane lifted off into the black French sky, the pilot glanced back at her. Noor sat hunched over, parachute straps across her chest, eyes closed, lips moving silently, not in prayer exactly, but in focus, in commitment. Below them, Europe slept uneasily. Ahead of them, Paris glowed faintly in the distance, a city under occupation, marked by roadblocks, inspections, raids, informants, and bright red posters announcing executions in angry letters. Noor didn't know that within weeks, the Gestapo would be building a file around her. She didn't know they would learn her codename, Madeleine. She didn't know they would pin her down as the last active radio operator in the city. All she knew, as the green jump light came on and the cold air rushed into the fuselage, was that she had chosen this. She stood at the door, heart-hammering, a gentle girl who wrote children's stories, now stepping out into the jaws of a city where kindness got you killed. Bon chance, the dispatcher shouted over the engine. Noor jumped. For a few seconds, she was utterly alone in the night, no aircraft, no ground, just darkness and the sound of wind tearing past her ears. Then the parachute opened with a violent snap. The city rose to meet her. Somewhere down there were allies. Somewhere down there were traitors. And somewhere, in a brightly lit office, a Gestapo officer would soon be frowning at an intercepted signal, saying, find out who Madeleine is. They thought they were hunting a spy. They had no idea they were hunting a woman who had already made peace with the price she might pay. When Noor landed, Paris didn't welcome her with silence. It greeted her with the sound of boots. German boots. Patrols moved like mechanical shadows through the streets, stopping anyone who walked too fast, spoke too softly, looked too foreign. She hid her parachute under the nearest hedges, checked the address burned into her memory, and walked toward the meeting point with a calmness she did not feel. The city she had once known, the cafes, the gardens, the light on the Seine, had been crushed under a new rhythm. Fear had a temperature here. You could feel it in the air. Her first contact, codenamed Jacques, opened the door only after 3 knocks. Spaced exactly as instructed, he studied her in a way that made her wonder if he regretted agreeing to take her in. She was smaller than he expected, softer than he imagined, but when she placed the radio suitcase on his table, her expression was steady, almost steel-like behind the gentleness. You're Madeleine, he whispered, as if saying it too loudly would bring death through the door. Yes. And just like that, she was absorbed into the Paris resistance network, a web of couriers, saboteurs, informants, and dreamers clinging to hope in a city strangled by the occupation. Her first night transmitting was the beginning of the legend. They set up the transmitter in the attic of a small bakery. While the smell of bread drifted upward, Noor connected wires with delicate precision. She checked her watch. She had 20 minutes, at most. After that, German detection vans, gray, windowless, prowling like predators, could triangulate her signal. She breathed in, touched the key, and sent her first coded message to London. The tapping of the Morse key echoed in the small room like a heartbeat. Short, long, short. Information jumped across the channel. Names, rendezvous points, sabotage plans, important enough that officers in London leaned in closer when they saw the origin of the transmission. Paris, new operator, strong signal. When she finished, Jacques blew out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. You stayed on for 28 minutes, he scolded. Yes, she said calmly. Why? The message was not finished. He stared at her. It was the first moment he realized she wasn't fragile at all. She was controlled, focused, dangerous in a way her appearance never suggested. But danger cuts both ways. Within a few weeks, the Gestapo began to notice something new. A signal, clean, steady, precise, not the sloppy work of inexperienced agents. This one was different. They circled a coordinate on the map of Paris. Madeleine, the officer muttered, tapping the paper with a pen. That is someone we must catch. Every transmission Noor sent tightened the noose around her neck. And then the collapse began. One by one, the resistance network she had joined was infiltrated. A courier was arrested, then another, then the leader. Within a month, every major member of the circuit had been captured or compromised. One evening, Jacques didn't return. By midnight, she knew what it meant. She was alone. London sent a message. Evacuate immediately. Radio network blown. Your survival is priority. She refused. If Noor left, Paris would go dark. No more sabotage reports. No more intelligence. No more lifeline between the occupied city and the outside world. She wrote a single line in her notebook, almost like a vow. As long as Paris breathes, I will transmit. And she did. She moved constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice, never transmitting from the same rooftop, attic, or abandoned room more than once. She disguised her radio inside a hatbox or a laundry basket. She sent messages while children played downstairs, while German troops drank at cafes outside, while searchlights swept across windows searching for any sign of treachery. Her signal was everywhere and nowhere. London couldn't believe it. The city that had swallowed entire networks could not catch one woman. Reports came back calling her the most elusive operator in France. A ghost, a master of survival. But survival has limits. One night, while she transmitted from the third floor of an elderly widow's apartment, she heard it, boots on the stairs, heavy, pounding, German voices rising. Her fingers froze on the key. The widow burst into the room. They're coming. Nora grabbed the radio, wrapped the wires around her arm, and sprinted toward the back stairway. She ran through the kitchen, down the service corridor, and out into the alley behind the building as the Germans smashed open the front door. She didn't look back. Paris swallowed her again. But the Gestapo was adapting. They knew her rhythm now. They knew her signal. They knew Madeleine was not a rumor but a threat. And then, the betrayal. It came from someone inside the resistance. Someone who knew her face. Someone who wanted money or safety or both. The name would only be known decades later. But in that moment, betrayal felt like a hook catching her sleeve. Noor was lured to a meeting. A simple one. A routine one. She knocked on the door. It opened too slowly. She stepped inside, and saw the boots first. Black leather. Polished. Gestapo issue. A hand slammed her against the wall. Another grabbed the radio case. Madeleine, the man said with triumph, as if he'd been hunting a phantom and finally found its flesh. She struggled, more violently than they expected. She bit one officer so deeply that he bled. She clawed at another. She kicked, twisted, refused to be dragged silently. She fought like someone who knew exactly what awaited her. The Germans weren't used to this kind of resistance from a small woman. They bound her hands, shoved her into a truck, and drove her into the night. For the first time, Paris seemed to exhale. The ghost had been caught. But even then, even in chains, Noor looked at them with a calm defiance that made one officer mutter, "She doesn't look afraid." He was wrong. She was terrified, but she refused to give that terror to them, because she still had one weapon left. The truth they desperately wanted, and she was determined never to speak it. They took her to Avenue Foch, the heart of the Gestapo's Paris headquarters, an elegant building turned into a factory of fear. Marble floors, polished banisters, and chandeliers masked what everyone whispered. Once you entered, you rarely walked out again. Noor was dragged down a hallway where the walls were so thin she could hear the question in other rooms, shouting, crying, the metallic slam of a chair overturning. A guard yanked her into an office lit by a single desk lamp. The light made her blink, but she didn't lower her eyes. Across the table sat a man with sharp cheekbones in a neatly pressed uniform. He studied her the way a surgeon inspects a patient, cold, precise, without emotion. "So," he began, "this is Madeleine." He said it as if he'd been waiting weeks to pronounce that name aloud. Noor remained silent. The officer clasped his hands. "Your network is finished. The others have already spoken." He leaned forward. You will tell us the rest. Her heartbeat thudded in her chest, but her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady. I have nothing to tell you. That was the beginning of the war inside the war. Every day, they questioned her. Every day, she refused. They tried threats first, execution, torture, reprisals against her family. None of it cracked her. Then they tried offers, comfort, leniency, even freedom. She turned away from all of it. You are wasting your time, she said quietly one morning. I will not help you. Her defiance infuriated them. She wasn't a trained killer, not a soldier, not someone hardened by violence. Yet she resisted with a strength they couldn't explain. One officer wrote in his report, unusual subject, physically weak, mentally unbreakable. But resistance comes at a price. They locked her in a small cell with no windows. Only the cold stone beneath her feet and a thin blanket that barely covered her at night. Guards slammed the door open at random hours to deny her sleep. They shouted at her, pushed her, tried to exhaust her until she slipped. But she didn't. At night, she traced shapes on the wall with her finger. Morse patterns. Learning them kept her mind alive. She imagined transmitting again. Paris rooftops. The flow of coded words. The soft hum of the radio. In her mind, she was still free. But the Gestapo wasn't finished. After several days, an officer unlocked her cell and motioned for her to stand. You are being transferred, he said. To where? He didn't answer, but the answer arrived soon enough. A different floor. Deeper inside the building, where prisoners vanished into silence. They placed her in a room with a single chair, bolted to the floor. The officer slammed a folder onto the table, her signals. Intercepted and decoded, fresh evidence of her mission. He flipped a page. We know everything about your broadcasts. She looked at the folder, then at him. No, she said softly. You don't. It was the closest she ever came to taunting them. The interrogations became harsher. They shouted questions. They demanded names. They slammed fists on the table. But Nora refused to betray a single soul, not the couriers. Not the families who sheltered her. Not the children who carried messages in their coat pockets. In her silence, she kept them alive. Then came her first escape attempt. One guard made a mistake. He left her handcuffs slightly loose while transferring her between rooms. Nora waited until they passed the stairwell, then twisted her wrists hard. The cuffs slipped. She shoved the guard, enough to throw him off balance, and ran. Down the stairs, through the corridor, toward the back exit she had memorized from the sound of footsteps outside her cell. She reached the courtyard. The night air hit her face. For one glorious second, she thought she might make it. Then someone shouted. A gun lifted. Boots pounded. Rough hands caught her and slammed her to the ground. They dragged her back inside like a storm dragging in debris. The commandant was livid. You will never see daylight again, he hissed. She didn't respond. They placed her in solitary confinement. Instead of breaking her, the darkness gave her focus. Noor sat in the silent cell and repeated a single sentence in her mind. Over and over. I must not speak. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Time dissolved. Part of her wondered if London believed she was dead. But she knew one thing. The city she protected still resisted. Her silence mattered. One morning, she heard unusual activity in the hallway, doors opening, chains rattling, footsteps in formation. As guards marched her out, a German officer whispered to another, "They're moving the special prisoners." Special. That was what she had become, not because she talked, but because she didn't. They loaded her into a transtruck truck. The doors slammed shut. The engine rumbled. Through the wooden slats, Noor saw the city blur by. Paris. Her Paris. Slipping away like something she would never touch again. But she didn't break. Not when the truck crossed the border. Not when she was handed over to the next set of guards. Not when she entered a new prison where her name was replaced by a number. The war had stripped everything from her: clothes, freedom, comfort, safety, even her own voice. But the one thing she still owned was the truth. And she refused to give that to the enemy. In the end, even the Gestapo reluctantly respected her. A report written by a frustrated officer admitted, She is dangerous because she will not submit. But Noor knew something they didn't. She knew how stories worked. Her life had once been filled with fairy tales, soft music, gentle endings. Now she was living a different kind of story. One where the heroine is trapped, the walls closing in, the world shrinking, but the flame inside her refuses to go out. This wasn't the end of the story. Not yet, because as long as she stayed silent, as long as she held on a little longer, there was still a chance. For Paris, for the network still hiding in its shadows, and for the people whose lives depended on a woman the world underestimated. They moved her in secret, before dawn, under a gray sky that looked more like metal than clouds. A guard pushed her forward, chains rattling around her wrists. Nora didn't know where they were taking her, only that this journey felt heavier, colder, more final than anything before. She was transferred to Germany. The train carriage smelled of rust and fear, wooden boards reinforced with iron, narrow windows covered with bars. Across from her sat two other prisoners, men whose eyes told stories they no longer had the strength to speak. Noor didn't know their names, but she offered them something else, the steady calmness she'd held onto since Paris. One whispered, "Who are you?" She answered with the only identity she could still claim. No one important. But that was a lie. And they knew it. When the train screeched to a halt hours later, guards banged on the doors and dragged prisoners out into the open. Noor blinked at the harsh daylight and saw it, a fortress of stone walls, barbed wire, and watchtowers. Forsheim prison. This was where they sent the ones they feared, not to interrogate them, but to erase them. Her cell was a concrete box barely large enough to lie down in. No bed, no table, only a thin mat on the floor. The guards removed her belongings, even her shoes, and locked heavy iron shackles around her ankles. They told her the rules. You do not speak. You do not stand unless ordered. You do not leave this cell unless we drag you. Then they shut the door. The darkness here was different from Paris. It wasn't temporary. It was absolute. Days began and ended without light. Sometimes the guards opened the door to shout at her. Sometimes they didn't. She lost count of time, hearing instead the sound of guards' footsteps, the clink of keys, the distant echo of someone crying. She learned two things quickly. She was alone. The Gestapo still feared her. Why else keep her here instead of killing her? They had labeled her extremely dangerous, not because of anything she did with a weapon, but because she had held the line, silent, unbroken, while an entire network collapsed. And now they wanted to break the symbol more than the woman. Weeks turned into months. Her body weakened, but her mind held on. She found ways to keep herself alive, tracing invisible letters on the wall, reciting stories she'd written long ago, humming melodies her father taught her. She whispered them so softly that the sound never traveled beyond the cell. Sometimes, when the guards opened the door, she lifted her chin slightly, small resistance, but visible. They hated that. One night, a guard entered unexpectedly. He placed a bowl of thin soup on the floor but didn't leave. Instead, he crouched near her and whispered, "Why don't you tell them something? Anything. You don't deserve this." She stared straight into his eyes and saw a flicker of guilt, the first emotion she'd seen in weeks. "This," she said quietly, "is nothing compared to what will happen if I speak." The guard swallowed. He stood up quickly and left, slamming the door. Noor didn't see him again. It was said later that even hardened prison staff avoided her cell, not because she frightened them, but because her courage made them uncomfortable. She refused to become what they wanted her to be, broken. Then, one morning, the chains were removed, not because she was free, because they were moving her again. 3 uniformed officers came to her cell. They didn't shout or threaten. They simply said, "You are being transferred." No destination, no explanation, just that word again, transferred. As they escorted her through the hallway, other prisoners pressed themselves against the bars of their cells, watching her pass. Some whispered blessings, some cried her name even though they didn't know her story. To them, she was a symbol, a woman who had survived Forsheim. Outside, she saw a car waiting, black, Covered windows, a vehicle used for one purpose, to disappear people. A chill ran through her. They drove for hours, through forests and towns that blurred into shadows. She tried to count turns, estimate direction, but her sense of orientation had long collapsed in the darkness of her cell. Eventually, the car slowed. She was pulled out roughly. Her feet hit gravel. Ahead stood an iron gate topped with barbed wire, 2 guard towers, and a sign she recognized from whispered stories among prisoners. Dachau. Her breath caught, not because she feared death. She had accepted that possibility long ago. What she feared was silence, that no one outside would ever know what she had done, or why she had chosen to walk into danger with no weapon except a radio transmitter and her will. Inside Dachau, she was registered under a new classification reserved for prisoners of special importance. She was not placed with the general population. Instead, she was taken to a small building used for high-value captives, political prisoners, foreign agents, people the right considered threats. The guards acted differently around her, more cautious, more controlled. They refused to speak to her except in orders. They kept her isolated. She received even less food than before. Every gesture made it clear. They were preparing her for something. That night, as she lay on the thin straw mattress, she heard muffled bells from outside, a shift change, then quiet, then footsteps, slow, deliberate, several pairs. Her door unlocked. 3 officers stood there. One gestured. "Come." She followed. They walked her past empty corridors, then outside into the cold night. The air tasted sharp, almost metallic. They stopped near a wall, a place with no witnesses except the darkness. One officer unfolded papers, orders typed neatly, stamped with authority. Another officer, younger, refused to look her in the eyes. The third stared directly at her, almost studying her face. "No final words?" he asked. She lifted her chin. For the first time since her arrest, her voice did not tremble. "Liberty." The officers hesitated, just for a heartbeat. Because in that single word, spoken by a woman they tried so hard to break, was something they could never control, the truth of why they feared her. Not for what she knew, not for what she did, but for who she chose to remain, even here. At the end, a shot cracked the silence. Dachau swallowed her story, or so they thought, because what Noor didn't know, what the officers didn't expect, was that stories like hers don't disappear. They wait, for someone to find them, for someone to tell them, for someone to remember. And now, someone is. History rarely records the moments after someone dies, the quiet ripples, the unanswered questions, the threads left hanging in the dark. But with Noor, the story did not stop at Dachau. In many ways, it only became more dangerous, more elusive, more layered, because after the shot was fired, after the guards dragged her body away, after the prison walls swallowed her last breath, something strange began to happen. Her name vanished. Not immediately, not publicly, but quietly, systematically. Files disappeared. Witnesses forgot. Reports contradicted each other. And the Gestapo dossier that had once been so meticulously assembled was partially destroyed. Almost as if someone wanted to erase Madeleine, or protect her. For months, London didn't know what had become of her. To them, she was still missing, a phrase that carried more hope than truth. Some officers whispered she had escaped. Others feared the worst but refused to say it aloud. Her colleagues in SOE wrote her name on the operations board in pencil. Not ink, because pencil meant uncertainty, a thread not yet severed. But the resistance in France remembered, and they spoke her name carefully, like a secret shared only at midnight. The first true confirmation came from a survivor who had been transported from Dachau after the war ended. He recalled a woman with quiet eyes and unbreakable spirit, kept separate from the others. She never betrayed anyone, he said, not even under the worst conditions. But even that testimony felt incomplete, almost fragile, because there was something deeper hidden beneath the official version of events. As Allied investigators moved through liberated France, they began gathering documents, interviewing witnesses, piecing together fragments left behind. Sometimes they found physical evidence, burned papers, scraps of intercepted signals, photographs stored in sealed boxes. But sometimes they found contradictions. One officer wrote, "It is unclear whether the Germans understood her significance. She was handled differently, kept apart, moved carefully. Why?" Another questioned, "Why was she transferred so far? Why Dachau? Why not executed earlier, as standard for radio operators?" And then came the rumor, strange, unproven, but persistent enough to travel through intelligence circles. The Gestapo had tried to recruit her, not with threats, not with torture, but with understanding. A female officer, rare, but not impossible, was said to have visited Noor multiple times. Not to interrogate her, but to talk to her, to persuade her, to offer her role, safety, perhaps even freedom. Some said Noor refused without hesitation. Others whispered she pretended to consider it, using the time to gather information that she never lived long enough to send. The truth was lost the moment the war ended. But one thing everyone agreed upon: the Germans had not executed her casually. They waited until orders came from higher authority. Someone important, someone threatened by what she symbolized. Because by then, Noor had become more than a spy. She had become a myth, and myths were dangerous. After the war, when the British government began debriefing surviving agents, they encountered something that made them hesitate: the sheer number of people in Paris who claimed their lives had been saved because of her transmissions. A woman said Noor's messages warned her group of a raid that allowed them to disappear minutes before Germans arrived. A courier recalled receiving last-minute codes that led him to safe houses. A man claimed Noor's radio contacts helped orchestrate the sabotage of a German convoy near the Seine. These weren't official operations. They weren't planned. They were whispered, improvised, desperate acts of resistance, made possible because one woman transmitted long after she should have fled. Even the SOE instructors who once doubted her now spoke differently. One said, "She was too gentle for the field. That was our mistake. We misread gentleness as weakness." Another wrote, "If courage can be measured in silence, hers was immeasurable." It took nearly 2 years for an official confirmation of her fate to reach her family. When the letter arrived, it spoke of bravery, of sacrifice, of honor, but it didn't speak of the loneliness of her cell. It didn't speak of the months without light. It didn't speak of the word she chose at the end, liberty, like a final signal sent into the night. Her mother fainted upon reading the letter. Her younger siblings lit candles and sat in silence, letting the truth settle like dust in a room untouched for too long. London awarded her the George Cross. France honored her with the Croix de Guerre. Plaques were placed. Books were written. Statues erected. But none of those gestures captured the essence of the woman the Gestapo had called dangerous. Because Noor Inayat Khan wasn't dangerous for what she did. She was dangerous for what she refused to become. She remained human, compassionate, gentle, even when surrounded by cruelty. In a war defined by violence, she fought with silence. In a world burning with hatred, she protected strangers she would never meet. And in a time when fear ruled every street of Paris, she carried a radio heavier than a rifle and treated it like a promise. That promise didn't die in Dachau. It resurfaced decades later when historians opened forgotten boxes and dusty archives and found her name, faded, incomplete, stubbornly persistent. Madeleine, a ghost to the Gestapo, a mystery to historians, a hero to those who survived because she didn't speak. And now, the world was finally learning her story, not in whispers, not in coded signals, but in voices that refused to let her disappear again. But Noor's journey wasn't finished. Because even after her death, the story had one last twist, one final thread, one unanswered question that historians still debate. Who betrayed her, and why? The answer would not surface until years later, an answer darker, more unexpected, and more painful than anyone imagined. But that was another chapter. In the years that followed the war, people spoke of Noor almost as if she were a legend, a whisper carried on the wind of history, admired, decorated, symbolized, but still incomplete. Her courage had become clear. Her fate had become known. But one shadow remained, one question that kept resurfacing like a ghost in every archive. Who betrayed her? For a long time, the world pointed fingers in every direction. Some blamed informants desperate for money. Some blamed neighbors forced into collaboration. Some blamed German intelligence having grown lucky. But none of those explanations felt right. None matched the precision with which Noor had been captured. None explained the immediacy, the way the Gestapo had known exactly where she would be and when. The truth remained buried, until a file surfaced decades later. A file sealed with a faded stamp. A file marked with a name many wished had stayed forgotten. Renee Gary. She had been Noor's fellow agent, a courier in the same resistance network, a woman Noor trusted. When investigators revisited the case long after the war, they found testimonies quiet, evasive, uncomfortable, suggesting that jealousy and personal grievances had poisoned Renee's loyalty. Noor had risen quickly within the network. She earned respect, she earned trust, she earned responsibility. Renee, by contrast, felt overlooked. It began with whispers, then resentment, then betrayal. For a sum of money, unconfirmed but mentioned in multiple accounts, Renee left the safe house, went directly to the Gestapo, and revealed the location where Noor was scheduled to meet her contact. It was enough. Just one sentence, one address, one moment of envy that led to Noor being dragged into a truck on a dim Paris street. But the betrayal didn't stop there. Files revealed that Renee had provided more than one tip, details about radio timings, movement patterns, even the habits of certain resistance members. She had walked into the lion's jaws willingly and fed it names. Yet historians also found something else, something unsettling. Renee herself had been terrified. She was under surveillance. She knew she was compromised. She knew failing the Gestapo meant death. So was it greed? Or fear? Or both? The truth was ugly and human and agonizingly simple. Noor was now betrayed by an enemy. She was betrayed by someone close. Someone who should have protected her. Someone who knew her softness, her gentleness, her vulnerability. And that realization haunted survivors more than any German bullet. For Noor herself, the betrayal was never confirmed. She never learned the name. She never asked. In every interrogation, she refused to implicate anyone, even if the traitor's actions had sealed her fate. That silence was perhaps her greatest act of defiance. But as the truth emerged, another thread of the story appeared, one that changed the way history viewed Noor's final days. A guard at Dachau, interviewed late in life, remembered her presence vividly. He described something the world had never heard. She looked at us without hatred, he said. She was calm, steady, as if she knew she had already won. Those words echoed in historian circles for years. Won? How could a woman tortured, starved, isolated, and executed have won anything? But then you look at the facts. The Gestapo never broke her. She never revealed a name. She never gave them a safe house, a code, a location. The networks she protected were able to regroup after the war sooner than anyone expected. And through it all, they remembered one thing. Madeleine never spoke. It was her silence, not her escape, not her strength, not her combat, that defined her victory. Even today, British intelligence files still mention her refusal to cooperate as one of the most extraordinary acts of loyalty ever recorded. And yet, the story has one final twist. When Noor's personal belongings were returned to her family, years after her death, there was something unexpected among them. Something small, something metallic, a locket. Inside was a slip of paper with a short line in handwriting unmistakably hers. Keep courage, no matter the end. Her family cried when they read it. Not because it was sad, but because it was Noor. Gentle, kind, steadfast, speaking to them across time with the same softness she showed the world. And maybe that is why her story refuses to fade. Because Noor wasn't powerful in the traditional sense. She didn't carry guns or explosives. She didn't lead armies or plan invasions. She carried a radio. She carried hope. She carried a belief that some things were worth suffering for. And the world, in its noisy, violent chaos, is still startled by the magnitude of quiet courage. In Paris today, near the house where she once transmitted her messages, there is a plaque. Most people walk by without noticing, but sometimes someone stops, reads, learns, remembers. And on rare evenings, when the city grows soft and the street lamps fall into a warm glow, a passerby might imagine the faint tapping of Morse code drifting from an attic window. Dit da, da dit, a ghost of a signal, a ghost of a woman, a warning and a promise echoing through decades. Noor Inayat Khan, codename Madeleine, the spy who refused to break, the prisoner who walked to her death whispering, "Liberty," the woman who chose duty over safety, truth over survival, and silence over betrayal. Her story began with a whisper in the night. It ends with the world finally listening.